The University of California at Berkeley is said to be bracing, that's the quote, bracing for conservative speaker Ben Shapiro's upcoming appearance.
The university announcing free counseling.
I mean, no one cares about you. Get over yourself. I don't care about you. No one cares about you. No one's trying to stop you because you're irrelevant to me.
The LA Times publishing an article many are comparing to hurricane preparations.
But truth has no relationship to what's going on there. It's really just, you disagree with me, you're a Nazi, let's riot. Well, I mean, first of all, look at me. I'm just pure physical intimidation.
You're scary.
That's why
yeah,
I'm doing this,
very, very scary.
And look at me. I've been working out. I'm really ripped now. All right. Now the fun part. So we're going to do Q&A, and I believe there's a microphone down here on the left. As always, my rule is that if you raise your hand because you disagree, you get to go to the front of the line.
We are indeed going to do a Q&A. This is by far the most fun point, I would think. Correct, guys? Yeah. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, Berkeley red tape and fire code is going to require everyone who wants to ask a question to walk out and around and form a line over there on the outside of the lobby right there. We're going to have an usher ushering people in. After you ask your question, there's a green arrow following this way. You're going to stand right here on this X, and you're going to walk to the back. Even if you're sitting in the front, you're going to have to walk all the way back and into the other doors over there. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll wait for the first one.
Thank you guys for having me.
Oh. Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi. Thank you for coming. I do not disagree with a lot that you just said. That's why I'm here. Yeah, so let's talk about institutions, because you're saying we should not blame the institutions. I have an example, and please tell me why you think, that person, per se, is not victimized. So let's start with the beginning of a life. You're a baby, you were born into a really poor family, in a really poor community, where the school is not good, where crimes are high. You as a baby, I think, you're quite helpless there. And I would, according to my thinking, I would say that's quite unequal. And that is, I feel like that person, because if you think about education, that should be a public good. In my opinion, it should be provided equally in all communities instead of just based on, how rich your house is. Could you respond to that?
So, so if I'm getting your question straight, there's a bit of an echo here.
Yeah.
So you're suggesting that children grow up in unequal circumstances because of the school district they go to. Not all schools are equal. There are a lot of public schools that are garbage. And so kids don't have an equal access to success.
Yes, and I feel like in my world, in my political thinking, I think that is inequality and that is institutions failing people. So I agree with you that not all public schools are good, and I agree with you that there is such a thing as inequality. Of course there's such a thing as inequality. We're not all born in the same place. We're not all born equally intelligent. We're not all born with equal gifts. Some of us are born smart but short and will never play in the NBA. We're not all born, this is just a truism. The question is there inequity? Right? Is there an equity that needs to be remedied? And the question then is, what's the best way to remedy that inequity? So when you say that there's inequality, is that because there are a bunch of rich people who are screwing those poor kids out of a good school? I don't think so, because we're spending oodles of money in the public schools, particularly in poor areas, and it's not paying off very well.
What I would suggest is that the best possible solution is to devolve those dollars back to parents who presumably care about those kids more than the public school system does and allow them to choose the schools for their children. So I can agree with you that there's inequality. Then the question becomes, okay, how do we solve that problem? So again, inequality and inequity are not the same thing, and equating the two, I think, is a mistake. You can do a follow-up, that's fine.
Thank you. So I feel like, if we're getting really scholarly and academic here, that is exactly what Rousseau is saying, essentially talking about natural inequality and contrived inequality. Natural inequality would be inequality that you're saying, inequity would be the contrived one. And I feel like now in our society, the institutions is contributing to the ultimate contrived inequality, in the sense that children just do not have access to the same level of education. Granted, if they.
Well, I mean, so if we're going to construct utopia and then suggest all children are going to have the same level of education, that's just not reality. Okay, there's no place on earth that has that because that's just not the case. So you're right that there's a difference between difference in smarts and difference in the poverty situation in which you grew up. But the truth is that the biggest inequality and inequality, I would say, is parents who decide to get pregnant out of wedlock. I mean, if you want to look at academic underperformance, it has much less to do with the school that you go to and much more to do with your family situation at home. Again, I'm not arguing with you that any of these things are a problem. The question is, quote unquote, who's to blame? And I think this is where we get into a problem in politics, because the idea is that the person to blame must be the rich guy down the street. I don't think it's the rich guy's fault. I think that there are certain things in life that just aren't fair. And then the question becomes, okay, how do we maximize opportunity without invading the rights of somebody else? And I think the easiest way to do that is to let people keep more of their own money and to do more to privatize the school system and give people more choice.
Okay,
thank you. I appreciate it. That's great. They reveal them from behind a curtain and then they walk forth. It's like a game show.
Hey, Ben, I'm honored to be the second participant in this game show. But you made the argument that the gender pay gap is a myth.
Yes.
And one of the main reasons that this is the case is because that female STEM education is at a lower level than it is for men. Females are continually discouraged to not go into STEM fields at a rate that's much lower than men are. So I was wondering what you feel about this argument and how do you think it should be remedied or nothing?
Well, I mean, I think that it's a free country. You can choose what profession to go into. If the idea is that the pay gap is largely due to profession choice, that's obviously true. If you look at a lot of dangerous professions, firemen, people who work on oil rigs, it tends to be men because men want to go into those professions. It's also true that men tend to spend more hours in the workplace. It's also true that women tend to take more time off with babies. That's not a bad thing, by the way. It's not a rip on women. It's always bewildering to me when feminists are like, it's terrible that women take time off to be with their babies. Why? I think it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, completely agree. But I think there is a societal discouragement for women to go into these particular fields. I was wondering if, you as a problem.
I don't see a ton of evidence that there's societal disparagement of women going into being a firefighter. What I actually see is that there's an affirmative action program in many of these cases for women going into things like firefighting, because there's now an affirmative attempt to get women into these fields. I was referring to STEM fields, like science, technology. So the STEM. Okay, so James Damore has an interesting memo that got him fired from Google on this. But it is certainly true that when you look at, for example, what women major in college, the number of women who major in STEM studies, which has nothing to do with getting a job and paying, women major in humanities much more than men do. Men are just interested in this stuff more. That's not a terrible thing. I don't see why that.
Yeah, but I mean, there's societal influence that occurs even before the college level, right? I mean,
I don't know that there are a lot of people saying to a 7th grade girl who's good at math, you need to stop that and go read some poetry. I mean, listen, I have 3 younger sisters, right? I have my wife is a doctor, by the way. So talking about STEM, my wife's a doctor. My mom runs companies. That's what she does. So I'm very much for women in the workplace and being able for them to choose what they want to choose. I really don't see a lot. If you can tell me the person who's out there going, women in science, fie, then I'll stand with you and say, yeah, that person's adult. That's really stupid. If a woman wants to go into science and she's qualified for the job the same way that an equally qualified guy is, great. What I don't want is lowering of standards in science to meet any particular person, and I also don't want this idea that because a woman chooses not to go into science, and a lot of women choose not to go into science, and that creates a disproportionate percentage based on individual choice, that suddenly this is some sort of group discrimination happening in front of us.
Hi, first off, I just want to say thank you for speaking as a fellow Jewish conservative. Thank you so much for coming.
It's just the two of us, man.
So I wanted to ask you, do you believe that there's an explanation for why victimization has become the main tactic of the far left to gain support of the people?
Yes. So I think, first of all, I do think victimization was always a tactic of the far left. It was just economic victimization, right? Marxism is based on the idea that the proletariat are going to rise up and overthrow the bourgeois, that there's this vast group of underprivileged people, as they call it, who are going to rise up and they're going to break the chains that bind them and take over the world. So it was always based on this notion that you're being victimized by somebody else. But in the 1960s particularly, it was clear that as America was thriving so much in the 1950s economically, and America had become this great world power, the prominent world power in terms of the economy, it was very hard to make the case to people who are not as wealthy that you need to rise up against the country that's creating all your wealth. And so instead what the left decided to do was misdirect into a legitimate grievance, which was an ethnic-based and sex-based grievance, which made a lot more sense in the 1950s and 60s than it does in 2017. And so there's this idea that if we identify you as groups, we can use those groups to tear down the American infrastructure, this system that's been built by white men for the privilege of white men. And we couldn't tear that down based on class, because it turns out a lot of poor people in the United States still wanted to get rich, and they need that system to get rich. But you can do it based on group identity. Because if you can make women feel that the system is designed to keep them down, if you can make black people feel like the system is designed to keep them down, and then you can tell them that it's the capitalist system more generally that is designed to keep them down, and that whole system, the whole superstructure is rife with racism, it has to be torn out root and branch. If you can do that, then you can actually build a movement on the back of that. And that's what you're seeing in the Democratic Party actually right now. It's fascinating to watch the conflict between sort of the Obama identity politics Democratic Party and the Bernie Sanders Socialist Democratic Party. Because that's actually an old battle, right? I mean, that's the battle between economic class distinction-based victimization and identity politics-based victimization, which is really more what Obama used in 2012 to win re-election.
So would you say this is more of like get-rich-quick scheme, or if I can't be rich, no one can?
Well, I think that it depends on which people you're talking about. The people who buy into the idea of victimization, I don't think it's a get-rich-quick scheme so much as an I feel victimized scheme and I don't feel like taking responsibility. But for the people at the top, I think that it actually is a get-rich-quick scheme. I think the people at the top very often know exactly what they are doing and know, because they don't live like this, right? I mean, Barack Obama didn't live his life thinking of himself as a dramatic victim of society until he decided to write Dreams for My Father and revise everything, right? But the fact is that Barack Obama is a guy who really achieved his whole life. I mean, he was an achiever. And if he had been sitting around thinking how victimized he was his whole life, it would have been very difficult for him to get where he got.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Hey, Ben. Given that the single biggest predictor of intergenerational poverty is whether an individual was raised in a single or two-parent household, would you be for or against an affirmative action policy where the institution gives preferential treatment to applicants who were raised in a single-parent household, or do you believe that that kind of policy would give rise to more problems of its own?
Right, so here's my view on affirmative action. I don't believe that you should lower standards in order to let people in because you're disadvantaging somebody else, and you shouldn't do it by color. So let me put it this way. If you have a white applicant who scored 1,400 on their SATs, well, sorry, I understand they changed the system now, 2,100 on their SATs, and they want to go to a good school, and you have and that person grew up in a single family, a single parent family, impoverished, and you have a black person who's Colin Powell's kid who scores exactly the same score, then I think that if you're going to look at all the factors, you can say, okay, the person who had to overcome all these obstacles to get the same score deserves to get in. But that's based on overcoming obstacles. That's a character judgment. That is not a judgment on the basis of race. And I also don't think that it's a hard and fast rule with regard to single motherhood. Again, if you are the single child, if you're the kid who is the child of some famous Hollywood actress and grew up in the lap of luxury versus you grew up in Appalachia or the inner city with two parents, I think you have to look at totality of the circumstances, in other words.
Okay, one more thing.
Sure.
Who do you think is the smartest person on the left?
The smartest person alive?
On the left.
On
yes.
the left. Okay, sorry. The smartest person. Yeah, those are two very different questions. The smartest person on the left. Well, points to the Lena Dunham shouting guy. Let's see. I do think that, I mean, in terms of pure intelligence, I think that there are a lot of scientists who are on the left, you know. Like, I wouldn't want to get into a scientific debate with Stephen Hawking or Richard Dawkins. I mean, they're in a different field of specialty. So are you talking pure IQ or in terms of making good political arguments?
In terms of, like, your political rival. Like, who would be, like, intellectual rival for you in terms of?
I mean, I think there are people who I'd be interested to talk to about policy. You know, I think that when I was at Harvard Law School, there are a bunch of professors who are on the left, including Elizabeth Warren, actually, who she was relatively interesting to talk to, although got less so over time. There's a guy named Richard Parker, who's a professor there, who I really liked. Lonnie Guinier, who was a professor there, who actually ended up writing me a law firm recommendation. She was such a leftist that she was, I believe, nominated for Undersecretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, and a Democratic Senate rejected her because she was so far left. She was a smart lady. Again, I don't think that all leftists are stupid or anything. I think that they start from wrong foundational principles, and if you're a smart person starting from the wrong principles, you can reason your way into virtually anything.
Thank you.
First of all, I just wanted to thank you for coming. As someone who is left-leaning, I truly believe in freedom of speech, and I think that that is a principle that...
Well, thank you for coming.
So my question was about abortion, and I just wanted to know, why exactly do you think a first trimester fetus has moral value?
Okay, so a first trimester fetus has moral value because whether you consider it a potential human life or a full-on human life, it has more value than just a cluster of cells. If left to its natural processes, it will grow into a baby. So the real question is, where do you draw the line? So you're going to draw the line at the heartbeat, because it's very hard to draw the line at the heartbeat. There are people who are adults who are alive because of a pacemaker. They need some sort of outside force generating their heartbeat. Okay, are you going to do it based on brain function? Okay, well, what about people who are in a coma? Should we just kill them? Right? The problem is, anytime you draw any line other than the inception of the child, you end up drawing a false line that can also be applied to people who are adults. So either human life has intrinsic value or it doesn't. I think we both agree that adult human life has intrinsic value. Can we start from that premise?
I believe that sentience is what gives something moral value, not necessarily being a human alone.
Okay, because, so when you're asleep, can I stab you?
I'm still considered sentient when I'm asleep.
Okay, if you are in a coma from which you may awake, can I stab you?
Well then, no. I guess not. I mean,
I'm glad you answered that, because I have no interest in actually murdering you.
But that's still potential sentience, and it's still a potential...
I agree, it is potential sentience. You know what else is potential sentience? Being a fetus.
The issue with that... The issue I have with that, though, is that if I'm in a coma and I'm not, like, doing anything to anyone, I'm not causing any issues amongst the world, whereas an unwanted child may or may not be a burden to people.
Okay, well, there are lots of people who are unwanted, right? I mean, there are lots of people's parents who are unwanted, right? We're a bunch of college students. You know, the problem is that now you're shifting the argument, right? Before you were making the argument based on the intrinsic value of a life based on sentience, and now you're talking about the level of burden that somebody presents as a separate moral argument. Okay, I don't believe that you being a burden on somebody is justification for them killing you, as a general rule.
I'll leave it at that, but I appreciate you, and thank you.
No, thanks.
Hello, Mr. Shapiro. You have consistently praised the free market as the most effective means by which to combat racism, sexism, etc., correct?
Yes.
Right? You believe legislation prohibiting such behaviors is essentially unneeded in today's day and age because you have faith that people, such as yourself, are conscious enough to fight discrimination in business where it can be shown, and at the end of the day, a business should be given immense freedom to conduct itself in the pursuit of profit. My question is as follows. If insurance companies can charge young males as a group higher prices for car insurance than young females, because the former has statistically been shown to be more reckless drivers, does this not leave open the possibility in a free market system for insurance companies to charge premiums based on certain ethnic or racial categories if these ethnic or racial categories statistically correlate with more reckless driving? If you object to the notion of charging someone more based on a factor that that person has virtually no agency in choosing, such as race or sex, why do you not condemn the fact that young men have to pay more? If you do not object to the possibility that a person of a certain sex, ethnic, or racial group may have to pay more on that basis, then are you not failing to disavow discriminatory business practice?
Okay, so that's a long paragraph, but I think what it really boils down to, the answer is that what you're now conflating ethnic racism with risk factors. Okay, right. I don't conflate racism with risk factors, meaning if you are saying that insurance companies may use being black as a proxy for heart disease, for example, because black men suffer from heart disease at a higher rate than white men do of the same age once you hit a certain age, then my answer is that an insurance company is in the business of assessing risk, not in the business of assessing racism. So if they look at you and they say that this is a higher risk factor, I mean another case, sickle cell anemia, right? There are certain diseases that actually do afflict races differently. Tay-Sachs affects Jews differently. So the answer is you're an insurance company. Of course you're going to charge more to somebody who has a higher risk factor. That's not racism. That's just the profit motive. I'm not saying that everyone's going to get charged the same in an insurance scheme. Of course not. I assume that you and I won't be charged the same. I'm older than you, presumably. They'll measure our bodily health. I don't know how much pot you smoke. Like, they'll make a bunch of distinctions, you know, and they'll make a bunch of decisions as to what our risk factors are and how that measures out in terms of what I need to pay in order to cover my projections. But that has nothing to do with quote-unquote discrimination. That's just a basic market decision.
Right.
That's actuarial,
just for clarification,
decision-making.
So there was a study in which, I forgot what organization of the United States federal government did it, but Native Americans in Arizona were found to have, you know, to essentially be engaged in fatal car crashes at a higher rate than any other group.
Okay.
You think it's perfectly permissible for insurance companies to charge someone a surplus, just charge someone an extra premium by virtue of the fact that they are Native American in Arizona?
No, I think it's fair for an insurance company to charge someone based on the risk factor of driving. So what I would suggest is that in a free market system, this is why I defend a free market system, let's say there was an insurance company who did what you're talking about. Right? And the insurance company decided Native Americans get charged more.
Okay.
There would be another insurance company that would come along and they would say, okay, is it really true that Native Americans universally are being charged more, or can I undercut my competitor by looking at people on an individual level and looking at all of their risk factors apart from race? Because race is not inherently linked to drunk driving.
That hasn't happened with males. Because, for instance, not all males, you know, are going to be in and of it themselves like more reckless drivers than females. However, like as you said, neither is that the case for...
But this is why, I mean, let's be real
right?
about this. This is why car insurance companies have good driver discounts, for example. They have good student discounts, right? They actually do look at more than you just... Like, my insurance rates went up through the ceiling when I got caught going down the I-5 at 113 and had my license suspended for a month. They've gone down since because I haven't had a ticket for 5 years. So, you know, this is... So, the point that I'm making is that if you are suggesting that... If you're trying to line up discrimination with market-based profit, if your question is that... Can you imagine a situation in which a business makes more money by discriminating, and would that be okay? Then the answer would be, it's a business, you can do what you want in a free society, and I have no right to use your services. However, it has yet to come to my attention that racial discrimination in a business is an actual profitable thing over time in a free market system where people can compete, because race is not inherently connected to behavioral categories, right? The basis of racism is that race is connected to behavior.
Well, I'd just like to say, for instance, Thomas Sowell pointed out, like in his book, Black Rednecks, White Liberals, or whatever.
Yes.
That the Irish...
It's actually, right, it's white, yeah, you're right. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Right.
It's a good book, yeah.
I got that data point.
You got it.
He pointed out that the Irish, for instance, were in the Americas for hundreds upon hundreds of years, locked in destitute, grinding poverty.
Right.
Okay, so you just said that race, you know, if you're a company and you institute racist policies, won't, like there's no long-term gain to be made from those policies. And I think that that's erroneous to say, because as you know, inequities, inequalities, disparities do exist between certain communities. So
you'd have to show me the disparity based on race and why it's biologically inborn as opposed to cultural.
I'm not trying to say that it's not biologically born. I'm just saying that if you had a policy whereby you... Okay,
I don't want you to confound... Here's the problem I'm having, and I think we can stop at this, because I don't want to confound race with behavior unless you can show me that race is the inherent source of the behavior. And if it is the inherent source of the behavior, then we can have a separate discussion. But I don't see that. And if you show me that race is, in fact, that, then that's a separate discussion as to whether we have to force businesses not to take race into account. Is that fair?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Ben.
Hey, how's
I'm
it going?
farther north in California, predominantly conservative, writing And my question is, are you familiar with the Jefferson State movement? And if so, what do you think about it?
I'm sorry, I missed it because the echo.
Are you familiar with the Jefferson State movement? And if so, what do you think about it?
I'm sorry, what?
State of Jefferson.
I'm sorry, this is session effort.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I am familiar with it. I think that California is far too large and encompasses far too many different people of different political orientations for it to have this many electoral votes. That said, I think that the chances of separating California into, from a political point of view, the chance of separating California into 3 or 4 states with, 6 or 8 senators, that could be a very dangerous thing for the balance of the country.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Ben. Bert, this is a two-parter, PSA and question. So PSA is that even though there was a bunch of standby tickets and there was a line out the door, the administration revoked all the standby tickets for all those people, and I think that that should be openly shunned. That's totally bad.
Yeah, I did hear that, and that's egregious. I mean, obviously, look at this. I mean, we've got empty seats here, and the only reason we had more than 3,000 people signed up for this event. The administration cut off the upper balcony because they were apparently afraid that Antifa was going to somehow rip out the bolted down seats and fling them onto the people below. I'm not joking. Like, this was the actual excuse that they gave. And then we thought, okay, there were going to be a bunch of people who signed up on the left to get tickets and didn't show up, specifically so there would be empty seats. And as you say, hundreds of people showed up outside and were not allowed in because the administration seized the tickets. If it's for safety reasons...
It's cowardice.
Okay, I'll try to assume the best, that it's for safety reasons, but if it's cowardice, obviously it's cowardice and should be openly condemned.
All right, and so for my question, more towards drug use and the criminalization of drug use. I know that you don't particularly condone drug use, but how do you feel about the criminal justice system, with all these nonviolent offenders, all the money that we spend on all the nonviolent offenders and drug use openly? I mean, so maybe drug use is bad, but should we still criminalize it and treat those people the way that we do and lose money like that?
I am actually libertarian on drugs, so that means that... So let me be clear about this. People who smoke dope annoy the living crap out of me, and they smell terrible. That said, if you want to smoke dope and lose brain cells, then that's your problem, so long as you're not coming to me for a handout. I think that there are certain drugs, like, for example, PCP, that apparently makes you violent, and that has externalities. That's something that you have to talk about policing. You'd have to talk about policing in terms of, selling drugs to minors. But it doesn't seem to me that when you're talking about things like marijuana, for example, you couldn't police marijuana in the same way that you police cigarettes or alcohol. Just make it very difficult to sell to people who are underage. The biggest problem that you have right now is that marijuana is so plentiful in places like California that even legalizing it is not going to get rid of the black market, because it actually, the price is higher in the legal market than it would be on the black market. So that's a serious problem, and suggests that deregulation is actually possibly a worthwhile thing. There are some, I'll admit that I'm split on some substances. Like, obviously, when you look at the opioid epidemic and you see the addictive level of that, marijuana is slightly different because the evidence for addictiveness in marijuana is mixed at best. But when you talk about opioids, which are actually addictive, the higher level regulation of opioids seems to me not inappropriate.
So to clarify my question, do you think that we should still be criminalizing these non-violent offenders in regards to, any drug?
Again, it depends on the offense. So if you're selling dope to a minor, yes, that should be criminal. If you are smoking dope in your room, then no, I don't think that should be criminal.
All right, thank you.
Hello, Mr. Shapiro. So I'd like to first qualify my question before making it. So, Mr. Shapiro, as a conservative intellectual, I respect you deeply, and I agree with you on a host of issues. However, there is one where I disagree with you, which is what we should do about climate change. While I agree with you that we should be skeptical of climate alarmists, I cannot help but think of Pascal's wager. If the skeptics are right, we have nothing to lose. But if they are wrong, then we have a world to lose. In a 1984 election advertisement, Ronald Reagan's campaign said, if you think there's a bear in the woods, you bring your gun. Given this maxim and Reagan's decision to protect the ozone layer by limiting CFCs via the Montreal Protocol at a time when the science was very much split on whether or not the ozone layer could ever be repaired, would you support a revenue-neutral carbon tax that would be revenue-neutral in the sense that the tax would be balanced by lowering of taxes on like businesses and on individuals and things like that? Do you think that this would be a good insurance policy that would not necessarily give the command economists of the left what they want, but also entertain the possibility that maybe climate change is real, and maybe we should do something about it.
Okay, so here's my position on climate change. I would say, lukewarm on climate change in the sense that I think that the greenhouse gas effect has been proven in laboratories, that carbon emissions can make the world warmer. The question is the sensitivity of the climate to those greenhouse gas emissions, how much is absorbed by the oceans, for example, and what effect that has on the climate long term, because the computer modeling has been so flawed thus far. That said, even if you believe that let's say that we take the IPCC estimate, right? The IPCC estimate is that we're supposed to increase, I think, by the end of the century by 7 degrees Fahrenheit is the global estimate. So that varies obviously place to place. That also means that you have to take into account cost, right? So as far as a carbon tax, I haven't actually looked at the economics of what you're talking about specifically enough, but general regulations that have been proposed on carbon taxes talk about penalizing companies in such a way that the cost is passed on to the consumer. It seems to me that if you're going to create new taxes without dramatically lowering taxes, as you suggest, which is really what the left proposes, the left sort of proposes carbon taxes but no offsets, then you're going to end up with a situation where the cost of energy is passed on to the consumer, which leaves more people in poverty. And I think that pretending that there are no trade-offs when it comes to government regulation is foolhardy. I also think that the truth is that what we've seen is that greenhouse gas emissions are declining thanks to technological development. For example, the easiest way to lower greenhouse gas emissions right now would be to build a bunch of nuclear power plants, which is something that the left in California has opposed for a very, very long time. We haven't had a nuclear power plant here for like 40 years. If you look at the rise of Tesla, the idea that there's not new technologies around the corner that are going to help us mitigate the emissions is foolhardy to me. I think that when Reagan says, bring a gun into the woods, if you see a bear, the question isn't whether you bring a gun into the woods. The question is whether, or if you suspect that a bear is there. The question isn't whether to bring a gun into the woods right now, based on the economists that I've looked at. The question is whether you should randomly wander around the woods in a tank. Right? Is that worthwhile? Because the kind of solutions that it seems the left is suggesting are necessary in order to actually curb what they think is coming are so dramatic that you would talk about really dramatically lowering the American and the global standard of living in order to combat an ill that may or may not happen. And even if it does happen, may be easier to deal with 100 years from now. Our technology 100 years from now is going to be a lot better. And the idea, by the way, that people don't move populations is not true. I mean, population movement has been a consistent thing throughout human history.
Right, but what I'm specifically advocating for here is that the right come up with its own policy in service of solving climate change. Because right now, the discussion has been dominated by the type of people that you're talking about, who want to bring tanks into the forest randomly. Why I'm suggesting this carbon tax that is revenue neutral, that should be supported by conservatives, is because it is a better solution to a lot of what we're seeing on the left. And I think that conservative intellectuals like yourself, who have a lot of sway and who have media companies, could advertise this policy.
So I'd be happy to look. If you're asking me if I'll look at your proposal, the answer is yes. If you send me your proposal, I'll be happy to look at it. But I think that it's worth noting that there are actually three positions, right? One is that the free market and new efficiencies and new technologies will help curb this on its own, and that government regulation may not be the answer. Then there's the hard left position, which is we should take over everything. And then there's the position that you're advocating. So I'll have to look at your position and see where I think it stacks up in the vast scheme of things. But environmental regulations, I don't know many conservatives who are not in favor of some, at least minimal, environmental regulations, because those are externalities that affect people beyond you, obviously.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Shapiro.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Caroline. I'm a senior, proud liberal. My question.
Well, thank you for coming.
Yes, of course.
Whenever somebody on the left comes to one of my lectures, it's like an AA meeting. It's like, thank you, Caroline, for coming.
So my question is, since you believe abortion is the same as murder, do you believe women who get abortions, even when their lives or the child's life isn't in danger, should be put on trial for murder? Yes or no?
I think abortionists should be put on trial.
But I mean,
I don't think that women should be put on trial for a couple of different reasons. So the first reason is because I don't think that it is effective in deterring abortion to put women on trial for the killing of the unborn. The second reason is because I think that we in our society have unfortunately gotten to such a point that an entire generation have been indoctrinated to believe, particularly an entire generation of women, since that's what we're talking about here, have been indoctrinated to believe that a baby is a polyp, and so when they remove it, I'm not sure there's the actual mens rea necessary, the actual criminal intent necessary for a prosecution. So when we're talking about the typical pro-life position here has been that the woman is a victim in abortion nearly as much as the baby is. That there's an entire abortion industry that is geared toward teaching women that babies are not babies, and that getting a baby aborted is in fact a betterment of their life. So no, I'm not in favor of prosecuting women for abortions.
But I mean, there are a lot of women who do have the intent, right? Like if a woman goes to an abortion clinic, they are ordering the murder of their child, in your opinion, like what you would say. So
Well,
do they not
again,
have the mens rea?
so I gave you two reasons. One, a public policy one, and one, like, you'd have to show me, you'd really have to show me the case of a woman who went in there and said, I know this is a baby, cut its brains out. If that's happening, then that is infanticide. I mean, that's like, wouldn't you acknowledge? I mean, if a woman walked in with a baby that was 1 day old and said, here's my baby, kill it, wouldn't you put her on trial? But that's not what we're talking about. In the vast majority of abortions, the truth is, unfortunately, that women don't actually believe they are killing a child. They actually believe they are killing something that is non-human and is the same thing as removing a tumor or something.
So, but are you saying that you don't think abortion is murder then? Because there are.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that I'm saying that the vast majority of women who obtain abortions don't think that abortion is murder, and intent is a fundamental element in any criminal prosecution. I feel horrible for women who have abortions. I think that it's terrible for them. I think it's a lot worse for the baby,
But
obviously.
I think what's key is that you said a vast majority, right? There are women out there who know that it is a child.
And you make
have
law
an
and
abortion.
public policy based on the vast majority, not on the outlying case.
Yeah, but then you can't make a claim that abortion is the same as murder if you wouldn't treat them the same in public policy or in law.
No, I absolutely can, because there are many types of murder, right? I mean, there's manslaughter.
Yeah.
There's
so
unintentional murder.
I mean, like, what would your standards be?
So the doctor knows. That's why I'm saying the doctor has the mens rea. The doctor has the actual intent to commit a murder, because the doctor full well knows that that is a baby in there whose beating heart he or she is stopping.
So indirect manslaughter.
What was that?
So you would put them on trial for indirect manslaughter.
Listen, I would put Kermit Gosnell on trial for first-degree murder. I would put abortionists on trial for either second-degree murder or manslaughter. I mean, this is a crime against humanity that's occurring. And if you believe that, obviously, to be ideologically consistent, you have to say that. And this has been, again, the traditional pro-life position. I'm not aware of any major pro-lifer in America who believes that women should be put on trial for abortion.
Thank you.
Okay. Hey, Ben. My name's Andrew. And since DACA's been making a huge headlines throughout the whole nation, what do you think should we do now? Should it have been repelled? Should they have made it something else better? Or should we continue having DACA?
I'm sorry, what was the
DACA.
Oh, DACA. Okay, so first of all, my position on immigration is I'm actually very libertarian on immigration, except for two factors. One is government payments that go to illegal immigrants, and the second is the cultural assimilation issue for people who come across the border illegally and aren't willing to assimilate into traditional American culture. Right? So these are two serious concerns. I'm not as concerned with the economics of illegal immigration in the sense that people who say we have to restrict our labor force in order to maintain a certain wage base, I don't think that's correct, because this is why you see companies that actually offshore and outsource, because they're looking for cheaper labor. It's always bewildering to me when conservatives say, well, we have to maintain a wage base by restricting the labor supply. Then why aren't you for raising the minimum wage? That does exactly the same thing. It restricts the labor supply and raises the wage base. So as far as DACA goes, my view on DACA is that people who are here illegally, whether they were born here or whether they were brought here as small children or not, should be assessed on a one-by-one judgment. So I am not in favor of the blanket swath amnesty for millions of people based on how long they've been here. I'm in favor of looking at people one-on-one and saying, okay, this person's in college and looks like they're going to have a career and hasn't been taking welfare dollars. This person looks like they're a good American, or they want to be a good American. Put them in the back of the line on a pathway to legalization. But if you're here, you've taken welfare dollars, you're not going to school, you're not bettering yourself, you're not going to be a productive part of American society, you haven't imbibed basic American cultural hallmarks, you do that, you should go. I have the exact same standard for people who are currently here illegally as the people who want to enter legally. I have the same exact standard, except if you're here illegally, you go to the back of the line, you wait behind the people who came here legally.
Yes. All right. Thanks for answering the question. Special shout out to my friend Corey.
Hi, Ben.
Howdy.
Howdy. I want my question. It's a little bit hard to articulate for me, so please just bear for like a minute. I wanted to ask you about the recent politically polarizing tendencies of the media and a way out. So I identify two problems in particular. It seems the American news media has evolved to, I guess, promote sensationalism and intolerance toward other political views. I feel that this leads to a dangerous tendency for people to just choose their own media outlets in order to confirm their own biases. I hope you agree that this occurs with respect to all political affiliations. A little bit closer, maybe. Thanks. The other problem deals with fake news. Obviously, a term that's become like super nebulous. It's thrown around a great deal. But specifically with fake news, there are a lot of news websites of dubious quality, and we hear stories of how other countries or companies have used Facebook advertisements, for example, to promote to promote certain websites and sway easily impressionable opinions. So it's clear that Americans need, I guess everybody needs a basic access of reliable information. We need to have a reliable news media that informs the public. But it seems by default, Americans will seek out information that they find palatable. But this leads to me to believe that it should be the burden of the news media to be reliable and not, I guess, vitriolic. So like in the past, we've had something I think was called the Fairness Doctrine that was repealed like a few decades ago that required required outlets to present certain views. But obviously government regulation towards media information, that's a slippery slope. What's the way out? What do you think the way out is?
I think the way out is a more informed population, unfortunately, right? I think that the idea that the government should never be regulating speech or access to it. And once the government does that, then you're wandering into very dicey, quasi-fascistic territory. When it comes to consumers of media, look, the media are just going to provide you what you want to read. Okay, the media are going to provide you what you want to click on. And yes, I would say this, I think most of the people in the media, yes, even including the left-leaning media, do want to tell the truth. I think a lot of them don't recognize their own biases. You know, look, I'm conservative. That means the way that I cover the news is going to be from a conservative angle. I try to separate myself enough to say, okay, here's the facts and then here's my opinion. But everything that I say is coming from that point of view. I think one of the big problems in media is people don't do that, right? Like George Stephanopoulos tries to pretend he's an objective news source. Right? That doesn't mean everything he says is false, but it does mean that everything he says is coming from the former campaign spokesperson for Bill Clinton. And that should have an impact. So that means it's up to us to look at a variety of news sources. I recommend this all the time, right? Don't just listen to my podcast, go listen to Pod Save America. Don't just read Daily Wire, go over and check out Huffington Post. Make sure that you're reading a variety of news sources. If you actually want to tell what the facts are, the best way to do it is to read two opposing websites or two opposing outlets and think of them as lines that intersect at one point, and the point at which they intersect is the factual point. And whatever those two stories have in common, you can take that as probably the grain of truth in the story.
Am I allowed a brief follow-up? Okay. So I guess I understand your emphasis on self-reliance, but evidently, to the extent that you believe that one believes in the efficiency of free markets, evidently people tend to move to confirm their own biases, and that's not occurring.
Well, I think that's why, the founders relied on the idea that we were going to have a civically educated public. In the end, you're going to have to trust the people one way or another. I don't trust the government to regulate what the people see. I trust the government less to regulate what the people see than I do the people to educate themselves. And this one falls under the heading of, as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst system except for all the others. Right? Unfortunately, there's no way out of this box. People are going to have to inform themselves better. And yes, of course, people have a tendency toward confirmation bias. But that's why it's your job, if you know about confirmation bias, to suggest to people that maybe they should stop relying so much on their own confirmation bias.
Okay. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks.
Hey Ben, my name is Rayhan, and I'm a Muslim and junior in high school, and I've been really trying to hammer in what I believe in. So I've been listening to conservatives recently, and you've been one of the main educators, so thank you for coming here.
Well, thank you.
So now, I think you go a bit far when you talk about inequality being one of the stupidest things to measure, because Dr. Jordan Peterson talks about the Gini coefficient. So they calculate income inequality in neighborhoods and streets, and it shows that it's an increase in crime when you see your neighbor, earning more than you. So do you have any response to that?
Yes. There's greater income inequality between Bill Gates and his neighbor than there is between anybody living in the inner city, and there's no crime in Bill Gates' neighborhood. So I would suggest that it has more to do with poverty in a neighborhood than it has to do with income inequality in a neighborhood.
Okay. And I had one more question. You talked about institutional racism and how it doesn't really exist. And I don't think you've digged up enough if Have you heard of bank lending discrimination? And it's been well
Yes,
documented.
okay, so bank lending discrimination, the idea of redlining was widely debunked in the early 2000s with regard to how banks operate. The idea that banks sit around and then they figure out, okay, there's a black guy and he has exactly the same credit score as a white guy, I'm not going to give him a loan. Banks base it on credit scores. If they didn't, they would go out of business. So a lot of this has been wildly exaggerated. Again, if you can show me a bank that actually is redlining, then they will be prosecuted under federal law. That's a violation of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. You can't discriminate even in private businesses on the basis of race.
Yeah, J.P. Morgan Chase just had a settlement for $55 million for discriminating against Hispanics and blacks who had the same score as white people.
Right. Okay. So then they got punished under the law, and that's a good outcome.
Okay.
Again, that would be a case where I say that's a great example, singular case where somebody gets punished. They should be punished, you know. And by the way, even if they weren't punished, let's say they weren't punished. Let's say you took my total libertarian theory, businesses should be able to do what they want. Then what you would suggest is that these people should have walked across the street to another bank that wasn't redlining them, and then they should have gotten a better loan.
But wouldn't you say J.P. Morgan Chase is an institution?
Well, as an institution, they did something bad, and I think capitalism makes them go bankrupt.
Right.
Again, I think discriminating against clients is a very easy way for you to go bankrupt.
Right. Thank you so much.
Shalom. I'm a huge fan of yours. By the way, I love your work. You mentioned that inalienable rights are given to us by God, but I've noticed that there is an argument to the contrary posited by political philosopher Hillel Steiner. It consists of the following three things: the will theory, the interest theory, and Hofeldian deontic logic. The will theory states that rights govern our choices and come from our choices, but if we have the inability to make a choice or the incompetence to make a choice, then our rights can effectively be voided. The interest theory is the opposite. It says that we can't void our rights, but they can be affected by the breach of a duty by another party. So somebody else can take away our rights under the interest theory. Under Hofeldian deontic logic, there are four types of rights: privileges, claims, powers, and immunities. All of those cancel each other out and can be taken away at any time. Do you have any expertise on this, and can you offer an argument to the contrary?
Okay, well, I can't say. I wouldn't want to be unfair to the author that you're citing, since I have never read that author. So, and I'm sure that you're doing a really great, back-of-the-envelope job summarizing the argument. But with that said, it's hard for me to take on an argument that I would want to actually read more about before I take it on. Is this an argument based on? So here's my basic question. The reason that I say that rights are based on God-given rights is the idea that is long held in the Western canon, a combination of Judeo-Christian values and Aristotelian philosophy, that suggests that individuals have certain rights as a facet of their reason, and that reason is originally provided by an unmoved mover. Right? So the idea here, the reason that is important, as opposed to an atheistic philosophy of rights, is it's very difficult for me to see why an atheistic philosophy of rights. I don't know if this is an atheistic philosophy, is it?
It has no religious components. So that's
okay, so if you do it without reference to the inherent value of a human being, then certain people just fall by the wayside. I mean, even in the theory that you're espousing to me, which again I'm only getting sort of the bare bones of it. You even in that, when you say, for example, will, if you don't have the capacity to exercise will, your rights go away. Okay, well, there are a lot of people like children who don't really have the capacity to exercise fully their will. Do they have any rights at all? I assume they have the right not to be killed. I assume they have the right not to be abused.
To my knowledge, they don't. America is one of the few developed countries with no children's rights.
That's not true. Children obviously have rights, which is why you have Child Protective Services that comes in and takes kids out of their parents' home if they're being abused. Kids don't have the rights to control, where they go to school. They don't have the right to control a lot of things about their life, but they certainly have basic human rights. I mean, I think the entire society is built around the idea of how do we assure basic human rights to children.
Okay, that essentially answers my question. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, I didn't quite follow everything, so I'm kind of trying to get up to speed with what's happening. But I wanted to thank my son. He's a senior in high school. He's the chairman of the YAF. He's sitting right over there. He is brilliant. He's the one that kind of turned me on to the podcast. I really enjoyed listening to sound speech, taking out some of the vulgarity, but...
We're in a college.
I mean, yeah. So
nobody would understand me if I didn't drop a bullshit once in a while.
So okay. My main question was going to be the role of the church and in the founding of our nation being so great, you being Jewish, I'm a Christian, I'm a devout follower of Jesus. I was able to get to the front of the line because I told him I was liberal because I'm a follower of Jesus. And he was one of the most liberal human beings, God in the flesh, human man that ever walked the face of the earth. He helped people, all of that good stuff. So, one other thing to caveat into this, how you reconcile the role of the church and in influencing culture.
Sure.
And also the fact that I grew up in California. It's known to be a more liberal state of our nation. I lived in Tampa, Florida for 3.5 years, worked for Hillsborough County, and I used a whites-only bathroom while I was there in 1995. It wasn't being used as such, but I don't know if it was the coloreds or the whites, but I asked the bailiff if I needed to use the restroom. I wasn't familiar with the courthouse. He said, well, we usually use the one, there's no sign on it, go in there, 1950s fixtures or 40s. Looked across the hall, there was a men's restroom. I said, this is interesting. I grew up in California, I'm living in the South. So I walked across the hallway, 1950s fixtures. So I think kind of balancing out the fact that there has been injustices in our country.
Yes.
You can't go back and change that, but you can tell those people that are living a victimized mentality that, look, yes, I understand because I don't know which it was whites or colors or whatever, but my wife grew up in Cuba, and I can go on and on. Answer the question, but I really enjoyed it, but
a couple of things.
Go ahead.
As far as the role of the church in American society, your first question. My basic philosophy on this is that the government exists to preserve certain basic rights, and then you have social institutions that need to provide the safety net for the rest of society. So I'm very much for a strong church in regards to communal life. I mean, I belong to a synagogue. I believe that if you fall on hard times, then that means that the first thing that you need to do is go to your family, and then the second thing you need to do is go to your church, and then you go to your local community, and then up the scale. The problem that I see in society right now is that people go to the top of the scale, the federal government. They don't bother with anybody lower down on the scale, which is why you see this consistent growth in the federal government. Judeo-Christian values, as I've said 1,000 times, are the root of the civilization and cannot be ripped away without collapsing the civilization on top of it. As far as the idea of the existence of past racism in the United States, of course I agree that's true. I mean, I said that right in the speech. Obviously I agree that slavery and Jim Crow were some of the worst evils perpetrated by human beings. I mean, they're truly, truly evil. The question now is, we have people who are living now who have not committed those sins. Do we punish them for the sins of their fathers, in other words? And is the best thing to do to teach an entire generation of young black people, for example, that America is inalterably racist, inalterably bigoted, and they're living in a country with such a brutal history of racism that they cannot rise, because that actually is false, backwards, and hurts them. That's my main philosophy. So you can understand when people say, listen, I mean, as a Jew, Jews have had a long history of oppression also, but that doesn't mean that I think that anybody owes me anything, and I don't think that it's appropriate to teach children that somebody owes you something as a general rule who have not done anything to you. I think that if somebody's done something to you, then they do owe you, but if they haven't done anything to you, then they don't owe you anything. And if you build a system based on you having to rectify mistakes that were made by your grandfather, we're never going to get beyond this. We're never going to get beyond this, because we all sinned against each other's grandfathers.
I agree. Thank you.
Hey, Ben. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I disagree with you on a lot of things, but...
Well, thank you for coming anyway.
Yeah, of course. I think the one thing that I agree with you on is that free speech should be protected. But my question has to do with, political economy. I know you're a firm believer in that the government sucks at everything.
Pretty much, yeah.
You're also a firm believer that, market-based competition is good. So I was wondering, what do you think about the role of bureaucratic institutions or regulatory bodies to protect competition? For example, the FCC sort of trust busting the internet providers from doing price discrimination.
You're talking about antitrust laws? I'm not a big believer in antitrust laws because I think the vast majority of things that the government declares monopolies are not in fact monopolies. The definition of monopoly is ownership of 100% of market share, which allows you to arbitrarily set prices and also to presumably buy out all of your competitors or use regulatory capture in order to prevent them from entering the market. I think the cases that are generally brought on antitrust grounds are very, very weak because they're usually large competitors even within the same industry. So to take an example, when they broke up Microsoft, Microsoft did not control 100% of the market. I don't even believe it controlled 75% of the market. It controlled something like 50% of the market, unless I'm getting this wrong. And they broke it up anyway. Apple overtook it in stock, and probably would have without breaking up Microsoft. So the idea that the idea that antitrust law is a valuable tool, there may be cases in which there are actual natural monopolies, but even in those cases, you'd have to prove that there's actually an attempt to screw the customer, that price gouging is going on, because sometimes you actually have a natural monopoly in a particular market, and the pricing is going just fine. Like, nobody was complaining about Microsoft's pricing when they were a supposed monopoly.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks.
What's up, Ben Shapiro? My name is Kyle Chapman, also known as Bay Stickman. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Just want to let you know the Proud Boys are here. We got your back tonight, man.
Well, I appreciate
about 30 of us right here. We got your back, brother.
Listen, I appreciate everybody having my back, and I'm very glad that the police were the only ones who had to do it, because that's their job.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're going to leave it at that. Look, I just wanted to ask you a question. You talk a lot about racism. There seems to be a lot of racism directed at whites these days. There seems to be just a constant, relentless diatribe about how whites should feel guilty for who they are, about the dangers or how terrible whiteness is and how we need to disavow our whiteness. What's your opinion on this? And on the war on Western civilization, and what do you think their intent is? Where do you think they're going with this?
So as I said actually in the speech, I think that using identity politics as a way of posing groups in opposition to one another is terrible. And I think that you do see that. I referenced this in the 2012 election cycle. I think that when, for example, Joe Biden said that Mitt Romney wants to put you all back in chains to black folks, I think when he said that, that was quite awful. And the sort of extension of that to the idea that there's a white privileged society seeking to keep black people down, or that the cops are systemically racist, and you can't show evidence the cops are systemically racist, but they must be. That white society was built on this grand lie that they have to keep other people down. Yeah, of course that's racism. Of course that's racism. And there's a foolish notion going around on the left that the only people who can be racist in America are white people. That's obviously untrue. Everyone is capable of being racist. All that means is that you're labeling another group with particular behavior or properties based on their race. So of course that's true. I think that the big mistake we have to be careful not to make is to start identifying as our quote-unquote group identity just because other people want to box us in. We're individuals, right? If somebody says to you, you're white, and you are crushing my soul, and you're ruining my life because you're white, my proper response probably shouldn't be, no, I'm making your life better because I'm white, right? My proper response should be, I'm making your life better because I'm an individual who's not making your life worse. And so I want to be careful of the identity politics on all sides. But yes, of course, there's racism against whites. There's racism against blacks. There's racism against lots of people in society. What I care about is the individual instances that we can fight, which you do see, right, against people of all races, not always proportionately, right? Look at the FBI statistics. But I also want to fight the laws that are racist. So, for example, I think affirmative action is a racist law, right, because it is actually judging people based on race.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, brother. Let's hear it for Ben Shapiro!
Hello, Mr. Shapiro.
Hey, how are you?
Today's my birthday, and I'm honored to be here, and I can't think of a
Well, happy
better way to
birthday,
spend
and thank
it.
you for coming.
So I have a comment and a legitimate question. The comment being, while there's a lot of things I disagree with what you're saying, but I definitely agree with your opinions on how culture is ruining the black community and why blacks don't graduate from high school due to culture. I think there's an element that you might be missing, and I'm not sure if you brought it up before. So, in the late 60s, early 70s, or late 70s, early 80s, when CIA introduced crack into the black community, which started a snowball effect of, blacks being overly criminalized for drug possessions, black fathers leaving the home and not sticking around, which led into, in the 80s of black children being being brought up without fathers, with mothers not being able to give them proper discipline. And while I do agree today that black communities suffer, for not having fathers in the household, but equally due to the culture around them. Like I suffered from it myself. If a black person wants to be educated in the hood, we get called, house Negroes and, Uncle Toms, if I want to better myself. But I was, the element of originally introducing crack into those communities, which eliminated fathers from the home, I think those still have effects today. And while I agree that there isn't systemic racism keeping black people down now, I think the triggers that happened back then still affect us today.
Okay, so obviously past affects present, no question. The question is who committed the injustice and who should be punished for it. As far as the CIA introducing crack in the black community, I'm going to plead ignorance on this one because I have no idea whether that's true. Okay, but I will say that when it comes to single motherhood in the black community, that did not start in the 1980s with crack. That started in the mid-60s with the increase in welfare. The increase in the welfare state dramatically increased the level of single motherhood in the black community. It was 20% around 1960. Today it's in excess of 70%. Yeah. And again, I don't think that the crack epidemic can actually explain all of that because the crack epidemic really lasted from like the early 80s to basically the early 90s. And you've seen it continue, single motherhood's continued to grow actually in the black community. It's sort of stabilized now, but it continued to grow for a long while after that. Also, I think it's worthwhile noting that when we say things like, somebody introduced crack into the black community, whoever, quote unquote, introduced crack into the black community, and again, I have no information to substantiate your theory, but it is individuals who take crack, right? Unless you are forcibly being injected with crack, then you have to make the choice to take the crack in the first place. And it's also worth noting that there were a lot of black legislators in the inner city who were looking for harsher sentences on crack cocaine, specifically because it was an epidemic in the inner city and was ruining a lot of lives. So the only way I think that when it comes to the single greatest intergenerational poverty statistic, the only way to walk this back is not through reparations, I think. It's through it really is through culture. It's through reinculcating the idea that fathers need to stick around, and you're a bastard if you don't stick around after you father a child.
Absolutely. So my question...
And that's true for white, black, or green. It doesn't matter to me. I'm a dad of two. You abandon your kids, you are just the worst kind of piece of garbage.
Absolutely. So my question... I started getting involved in, so to speak, right-leaning issues after Milo came to Berkeley. I got assaulted by an Antifa member. He tried to set me on fire with a lit flare. He called me a Nazi. Just today, I got called a Nazi.
You don't look like a Nazi, I gotta tell you.
No. Just today, I got called a Nazi, a fascist, and I consider myself a left-leaning liberal centrist. Now, with that said, MAGA crew has shown me so much love in these past 8 months. Everyone I've met has been reasonable, opened up their homes to me. We've had wonderful discourse. So my question now is, as a person who, like I said, considers myself a liberal, and I interact with people, on the right and MAGA crew, I still have people in my own personal community that, say that, oh, you're talking to you're supporting white supremacy, you're talking to Nazis, you're supporting them. What would you say to a person like me who is open to discourse and people of all sides? How would you combat, or at least how would you approach people who come with me with hate and saying like, no, you're a bad person because you're hanging out with these people?
Well,
how
again,
should I approach them?
So I have a basic rule on this, and it's the same, again, regardless of color, because I've said this to people of every color. If somebody calls you a racist or a bigot based on no evidence, this makes them a bad person, and you have every right to say so. They need to actually cite evidence for why you're a racist or a bigot or a bad person before they can call you that. It needs to actually be justified. And you have every rationale to walk away from that conversation thinking that person is a worse person if they can't explain to you what you've done wrong and why what you've done is so terrible.
Okay, that works for me.
And thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
So Ben, I myself had a question. I'm a member of the Berkeley College Republicans, and I myself, this semester we're starting a new conservative newspaper at UC Berkeley. It's called the Berkeley Patriot, and we're fighting really hard for everything we stand for and for the principles that we've, known to grow in love and everything like that. My question kind of surrounds what's been going on politically. I think UC Berkeley is kind of a microcosm for the rest of the country in a lot of ways. You spoke here, you just said this in your speech, but you spoke here in 2016, and there were no protests, nothing at all. And it's just, it's crazy to me that now we have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get you in a room and talk to us again. And I kind of think it relates to the Overton window. I'm not sure if you know about that, but it basically, the range of potential discourse in society that's considered acceptable. So the furthest right thing you could probably say like, 10 years ago is probably, I don't believe in gay marriage. That's no longer a thing. You can't say that anymore and still be accepted in society. So the Overton window is consistently just shifting leftward. And when I talk about this with my left-leaning friends, they say, that's an inevitable trend. This inevitable trend towards liberalism is just, it's something you cannot control. It's the way society is headed. And my question is, do you think it's an inevitable trend? And if not, how can we combat it as conservative students, braving this, horrendous climate with both, our peers calling us fascists and Nazis and the administration just being extremely terrible as well?
So listen, I don't think it's an inevitable trend. I think that things move in cycles. And I think that there's two ways that the country can break out of it. One is that things can just continue to slide downward to the point where people get wise after a long time. Or we can have events like this one that I think are actually really useful in showing the liberals that they are not the left. Okay, I do make a distinction. You notice I always use the language left to describe the left, not liberals. There's a reason. Liberals are people who believe in open discourse and believe in discussion, even if they disagree with me on the role of government in the economy, for example. Leftists are people who believe that I need to be shut down because my speech is insulting their identity and is a form of violence. If the liberals in the country can stand up to the left and say to them, enough is enough, then I think that there's hope for a discourse. And I do believe in the innate rationality of the American people and the capacity that they have for coming to the correct conclusions. I do think there's a possibility. I mean, that's why I'm in the business I'm in. It's why I spend my life trying to change people's minds. I think there are people who are willing to listen to facts and arguments. If I didn't think that, then I'd just go be a lawyer. So the fact is that I don't think any of this is inevitable. I think that's a little bit of self-congratulatory claptrap from your liberal friend. Oh, well, of course society is shifting towards us. Well, I mean, if that's the case, then why did Republicans just take the House, the Senate, all the state houses, all the governorships, and the presidency? Like, come on. But when you talk about the Overton window, I don't think that it exists just in terms of politics, left versus right. I think it also exists in terms of the nature of the discourse itself. And there I think that we have moved in a really negative direction. I think we've moved away from discussion and toward clubbing each other. And I think that has to be stopped in its tracks. And that's why I thank everybody here for coming and being part of a free speech event that, let's be frank, it was cordial, it was nice. I really enjoyed hanging out with all of you. And I think that we need more of this, because if we don't have more of this, instead we're going to get more of what you were almost going to see outside if it hadn't been for the force of the police officers.
We have time for one more question.
Way to make me the bad guy. I apologize to everyone in line. Some of you may know I got attacked with a bike lock back in, a while back. And I'm wondering what you think about this. Like, should I ask him, the man himself who hit me, to a peaceful, just brotherly, olive branch, nonviolent, ref there wrestling match?
So let me I just want to make sure I get the story straight. So you were hit by somebody?
Yeah.
And now you're asking if you should wrestle them?
Well,
this basically what it boils down to?
Not like on a mat with a ref, no hitting. Wrestling is not about violence. It's about getting the other person to give up. Without hurting him, not exchanging blows.
I mean, listen, if he's stupid enough to agree to it, more power to you. And I come from a place where if somebody hits me in the face, I call the cops. But, I mean, I guess that's an alternative solution if you choose to do it.
Yeah, he doesn't have to. This is...
Right, now, as I say, if you make him an offer and he takes you up on it, then, I mean, that's his move.
Okay, well, the court case hasn't happened yet. We'll see. After the court case, this doesn't have to do with the law. So I'm just wondering what you think about that. Is it a good idea?
Again, as I say, I mean, if you want,
words.
I'm a libertarian. If you decide to duel at 10 paces.
Wow. Okay, I like that thinking. Okay, and Lauren, if you're still here, can I get your digits, please? Check me out on YouTube /EmbryBros. All right.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming and being part of this.
As always, thank you for watching. If you like this video, please consider subscribing. Also follow us on the usual media for more and interesting information like this.
Fight their asses.